Imagine standing in front of a door that nobody has touched in 48 years. The brass keyhole has gone dark with age, the wood has settled into its frame, and behind it, not a single living person has stepped, not even the family members who walked freely through every other room in the house. Now imagine that man was Elvis Presley, the most famous entertainer America ever produced, and that everything he kept away from the world, every private thought, every painful truth, every piece of himself he refused to put on stage, had been sitting quietly on the other side of that door since August of 1977. This is not a story about a celebrity's forgotten belongings gathering dust in a corner. What Elvis left behind in that locked attic at Graceland tells a deeper story than any biography written about him. And when archivists finally climbed those stairs in January of 2025, what they found changed everything people thought they understood about the king of rock and roll. On a cool spring morning in 1957, a 22-year-old Elvis Presley drove through the iron gates of a property on the edge of Memphis that would become one of the most recognized addresses on Earth. $12,500 changed hands that day, a figure that translates to something close to $1 million now, and Elvis kept the name already carved into the gate. Graceland suited the place, and the place suited him. What started as a private home for a young man who had grown up desperately poor in Tupelo, Mississippi grew into something far more complicated over the next 2 decades. The 14 acres held barns, stables, horses roaming the back fields, and one of the more unusual residents in the history of celebrity households, a chimpanzee named Scatter, who wore tiny human outfits to parties and spent his evenings snatching drinks from people's hands and pulling at women's clothing. The staff used to say Scatter was the side of Elvis he kept locked away during performances, the part that didn't calculate consequences and just wanted to cause a beautiful mess. By 1964, as the Beatles were dismantling the cultural dominance Elvis had spent a decade building, he had a meditation garden constructed on the Graceland property, with fountains and flowers, and tall white columns standing under the Tennessee sky. That garden and the jungle room with its green shag carpet climbing up the walls, and the basement television setup where he could watch 3 programs at once, and the racquetball building where a piano stood waiting through his final hours, all of it added up to a portrait of a man living several contradictory lives inside a single property. The contrast between the garden and the jungle room alone told you more about Elvis than most of his interviews ever did. August 16, 1977 arrived like any other afternoon at Graceland, with the curtains drawn against the daylight and Elvis still in bed well past noon, running on a sleep schedule that had reversed itself completely over the years. His girlfriend Ginger Alden woke around 2 in the afternoon and moved through her routine without alarm, because Elvis sleeping into the afternoon was not unusual. What changed was the quality of the silence, something that settled over the house by 2:30 and made her knock on the bathroom door. No answer came back. Pushing the door open, she found him on the floor, face down, his skin gone blue, and the story his body had been trying to tell for years had finally reached its last sentence. Joe Esposito, his road manager, ran upstairs and started CPR while someone else called an ambulance, and paramedics worked on him all the way to Baptist Memorial Hospital with the sirens open through the Memphis heat. By 3:30, it was over. Radio stations stopped mid-song. Fans who heard the news while driving pulled over because they couldn't see the road through the tears. That evening, a medical examiner named Dr. Jerry Francisco stood before reporters and delivered what he described as a straightforward answer. Cardiac arrhythmia, his heart simply stopped. Natural causes, nothing more to discuss. Even in 1977, that explanation landed wrong with people who had watched Elvis deteriorate for 2 years. The man who had coiled himself around a microphone in 1956 and sent teenage America into a collective nervous breakdown had, by his final performances, ballooned to nearly 260 pounds, forgotten lyrics mid-song, and on some nights required physical support just to stay on his feet through a set. The autopsy told a different story than Francisco offered the press. Elvis's body showed an enlarged heart, a damaged liver, and tissue changes consistent with long-term prescription drug use at a serious level, and the toxicology report that came out later, the one Francisco had not mentioned to reporters, found significant concentrations of dilaudid, quaaludes, Percodan, Demerol, and codeine in his system. None of that pointed to a heart that had simply stopped for no reason. All of it pointed to a body pushed past every reasonable limit for years by a pharmaceutical schedule that nobody around Elvis seemed willing to interrupt. At the center of that schedule sat Dr. George Nicopolis, known to everyone as Dr. Nick, who had been Elvis's personal physician since 1967, and whose relationship with his famous patient had long since blurred every professional boundary a doctor is supposed to maintain. Between January and August of 1977, the final 8 months of Elvis's life, Dr. Nick wrote 195 separate prescriptions for him, which works out to roughly 1 prescription every day and a half. The year before had been even more extreme, with close to 19,000 individual pills prescribed to a single patient across 12 months. When investigators finally caught up with him, Dr. Nick arrived with an explanation prepared. Elvis suffered from real documented conditions: chronic pain from an army injury, severe glaucoma, a painful gut disorder called regional enteritis, and the prescriptions addressed those conditions. And then he offered what may be the most breathtaking defense in the history of medical ethics, telling medical boards that he was actually protecting Elvis by controlling his supply, because without that control, Elvis would have gotten the same drugs from less supervised sources. Tennessee authorities charged him in 1980 with 14 counts of overprescribing medication. A jury found him not guilty, and the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners spent the next 15 years continuing its investigation before permanently revoking his license in 1995, 18 years after Elvis died on his bathroom floor. A researcher named Sally Hodel complicated the picture further in 2020 when she published work suggesting Elvis may have been managing serious inherited health conditions that medicine in his era barely understood. Her research pointed to alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, a genetic disorder affecting lung and liver function, and suggested his immune system carried chronic vulnerabilities that made his medical situation far more desperate than anyone around him acknowledged. None of that excuses what happened, but it shifts the portrait from a man who simply lacked self-control towards something more painful: a genuinely sick person trying to manage real suffering with the tools available to him, surrounded by people who found his productivity more worth protecting than his life. Nearly 100,000 people came to Memphis in the days after his death, standing in lines that stretched for blocks, weeping on sidewalks outside the gates. On August 18th, 17 white Cadillacs led the funeral procession through the city, with James Brown, Sammy Davis Jr., and Caroline Kennedy among the mourners, alongside Priscilla, 9-year-old Lisa Marie, and Vernon Presley, who had lost his son and now stood in the August heat trying to hold himself together. Elvis went into the ground next to his mother Gladys at Forest Hill Cemetery, and Vernon believed the worst of it was finished. 2 days later, a group of men attempted to break into the cemetery at night and steal the coffin. They were caught before they succeeded, but the damage to the tomb was real, and the message was unmistakable. Even dead, Elvis was not safe from the world's obsession with him. Vernon acted quickly. Working with police, he had Elvis and Gladys disinterred and reburied in the meditation garden at Graceland, the private space his son had built for peace and quiet contemplation. and that garden became a grave overnight. New alarm systems went in. Security expanded to cover the grounds around the clock. Access to the entire second floor of the mansion, including the bedroom, the bathroom where he died, and the attic above, got sealed off permanently. The official explanation offered to anyone who asked was privacy, respect for the family. And that explanation held for 48 years, through Vernon's death, through Graceland opening to public tours in 1982, through decades of visitors who walked through the kitchen and stood at the meditation garden grave and always, always looked up at the roped-off staircase, wondering what was up there. The locked attic fed a mythology that had started growing within hours of Elvis's death. At Memphis Airport, a heavier man in a white suit and sunglasses gave the name John Burroughs, which happened to be a pseudonym Elvis had actually used when traveling, and bought a one-way ticket to Buenos Aires. 2 weeks after the funeral, a woman in Michigan reported that Elvis had served her at a Burger King in Kalamazoo, and that she recognized his voice the moment he asked if she wanted extra cheese. By 1979, the sightings numbered in the hundreds. Elvis at a gas station in Oklahoma. Elvis in a Missouri grocery store. Elvis at a Nashville concert wearing a false beard. The tabloid Weekly World News eventually created a dedicated section called Elvis Watch, just to keep up with the volume. Entire theories constructed themselves around the anomalies at his funeral. A coffin reported to weigh 900 pounds, a sealed casket after a public viewing had already happened, and most persistently, the spelling of his middle name on the gravestone as Aaron rather than the Aaron on his birth certificate. The family would never make that mistake, the argument went, unless there was nothing in the grave to mark. The internet gave those theories new life and new audiences, and online communities still debate them today. For the Presley family, these stories have always represented an impossible situation, where silence feeds the rumors and denial looks like concealment. None of that noise, though, should distract from what the conspiracy theories quietly accomplish. By keeping alive the idea that Elvis escaped, they let the people who actually failed him off the hook. Because a man who faked his death to live quietly somewhere warm doesn't need anyone to answer for his death. In the spring of 2024, a company called Nosany Investments and Private Lending, LLC, filed legal papers claiming Riley Keough, Elvis's granddaughter and the sole heir to the estate, following Lisa Marie's death in January 2023, had defaulted on a $3.8 million loan secured against Graceland itself. The announcement hit the Elvis fan community like a physical shock, and Riley's legal team moved immediately, filing an emergency injunction in Shelby County and arguing the entire scheme rested on forged signatures, that Riley had never agreed to any such loan, and that the documents were fabricated to steal the property. The auction had already been scheduled, and the window to stop it was closing fast. One day before it was set to happen, a Tennessee judge issued a stop order, described Graceland as a one-of-a-kind cultural asset whose loss to the public would be irreparable, and noted that nobody from Nosany Investments appeared in court to contest the ruling. Graceland stayed with the Presley family, but the episode shook Riley deeply enough that she made a decision nobody in her family had made before her. She authorized the opening of the attic. On a cold morning in January 2025, a small team of archivists wearing white cotton gloves climbed the narrow stairs at the back of Graceland's second floor for the first time since August of 1977. Their footsteps disturbed dust that had settled undisturbed across nearly half a century, and when the lead archivist turned the old brass key in the lock, the door opened with a sound everyone present would later describe in almost reverent terms. The attic stretched across the entire top of the house, larger than anyone had anticipated, with the dormer windows fitted with blackout curtains that had kept the light out all these years. A small air conditioning unit was still running, kept operational by maintenance crews who serviced it regularly without ever asking what it was preserving or why. What they found inside was not disorder. Everything had been organized deliberately, carefully, with an attention to detail that stopped the archivists in their tracks before they had even pulled on their first pair of gloves. Along the longest wall ran rows of boxes, each one labeled in handwriting archivists confirmed matched Elvis's own. Tupelo, 1945. First recordings, Army Days, Hollywood, Comeback Special, Vegas, and at the end of the row, a single box labeled simply After, dated 1977. The Tupelo section held a small stuffed bear, one eye missing, the body stitched together with patches of fabric cut from a woman's floral dress, and family records identified it as the toy Elvis had slept with as a child, during the years when his father Vernon sat in prison for writing bad checks, and his mother Gladys raised him alone on almost nothing. Those patches came from her own clothes. The faded flower patterns were still visible on them, and historians who handled the toy noted that the emotional weight of a grown man keeping that object in a labeled box for the rest of his life said more about who he actually was than almost anything else in the archive. The Army Days box held a Bible whose spine had been reinforced with electrical tape from years of heavy use, a Bible that had belonged to Gladys and that she gave Elvis when he was drafted in 1958, with a message on the inside cover about keeping his faith. Throughout the pages, margins filled with Elvis's handwriting, underlined verses, private prayers, questions he was working through, and the last dated entry appeared near Psalm 23 and carried a date from August of 1977, days before he died. The Hollywood section offered a leather jacket made for his role in Jailhouse Rock, and inside one pocket sat a handwritten note in his own hand that read, "Wear this when you need to disappear." Next to the jacket, a collection of books on Eastern philosophy, comparative religion, and the nature of consciousness after death, all of them heavily annotated. None of that matched the image most people carried of Elvis Presley, and that was exactly the point. The Vegas section produced a medical report dated 1974, marked confidential, with a cover page referencing cardiac irregularities and a physician's recommendation for immediate lifestyle changes. Elvis performed for 3 more years after that document was written, and whether he read it, and what crossed his mind when he did, nobody can say. But the discovery that silenced the entire room was a collection of reel-to-reel tapes labeled Practice Sessions, 1976. These recordings were not prepared for release or intended for any audience. Just Elvis alone, working through ideas, mixing gospel structures with blues, and something that sounded like early electronic experimentation, pushing toward musical directions nobody had seen coming from him. And on one of the final tapes, a recording of Unchained Melody, with no accompaniment at all. Just his voice in a room, shaking in places, slowing in others as if the words were carrying more weight than the melody could hold. A music scholar who listened to it later said it sounded like a man who knew exactly what was coming and had decided to face it through the only language that had ever made complete sense to him. Stacked nearby were unopened fan letters, still sealed in their original envelopes. The soldiers wrote to say his music kept them going. Families described surviving grief with his records playing in the background. Young musicians asked for guidance. One letter, postmarked 1976, urged him directly to stop touring and look after his health, and the envelope had never been opened. It sat there for 48 years, sealed, unread, its single piece of advice perfectly preserved and perfectly useless. Elvis received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2018, long after his death, Attack and the Awards and the rhinestone jumpsuits are the version of him that most people still carry around in their heads. But what Riley Keough's decision to open that door revealed is a different record entirely. A man who had organized the pieces of his own life with more intention than anyone expected, who kept his mother's stitched-up childhood toy in a labeled box, who marked Psalm 23 days before he died, who wore a specific jacket when he needed to disappear, and recorded songs for nobody when the performances were finished. The attic held everything he could not show the world, and everything he quietly hoped the world might one day be ready to understand.